The following podcast is brought to you by the Johners Podcasting Network, found exclusively at wrestlingwithjohners.com. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Legends Masterclass series, episode 6. And previous guests, previous episodes have included my conversation last year with Marty Jones, Tony St. Clair, Adrian Street with Miss Linda, of course. I think that was the last interview that he ever conducted. And of course, we've recently lost Adrian Street. This year I've had Johnny Kidd on the show on the Legends Masterclass episode 4, and more recently Lee Bamber, legendary ring announcer, World of Sport ring announcer, and still doing the goods today. But today, episode 6 of the Legends Masterclass series, brought to you by Wrestling with Johners. I've got Mel Sanders, superstar Mel Sanders. How can I mess up on that? Superstar Mel Sanders, how are you doing, my friend?
Yeah, I'm very well, thank you. As I said, I'm living in by the seaside now. So,
yeah,
I'm still training and still running. So, yeah, I'm doing okay.
Well, tell us about that then. Tell us, because I mean, you know, you look in fine physical form there, Mal, if you don't mind me saying. So you're still keeping fit, not necessarily in the wrestling ring, but I'm guessing just kind of your own routine nowadays.
Yeah, a lot of fellas, you know, like footballers, when they train for what they do, and then, you know, when they retire or when they pack up, you know, they just let it all go and stuff. But I've always, I mean, the boys will tell you, I've always sort of kept myself in shape and try to keep myself fit. It's not easier. I mean, I'm 65 now, so it's not easier as you get older. But I feel better for it, and it sort of brings me to life when I train. You know, it's not a substitute for being in front of people and wrestling and getting the buzz, but you know, it challenges me as well, which is good.
Absolutely. And 4 decades in the business, Mal, 4 decades. Well, when you started in your early 20s back in 77, did you ever expect it to go 4 decades?
Well, you don't. You see, the thing is, in those days, you were having such a good time that you thought it was going to last forever.
Yeah.
And, you know, I was around, you know, no disrespect to people who are in the business today, but I was around legends in the business, you know, and it was just a fancy. And I was sort of the baby of everybody. I was the youngest of all. And so they all looked after me. And it was just a great time. You know, I was brought in by Mike Marino, as you probably know, who actually died in my car. I don't know if you've delved enough to find out.
I was not aware of that, no. Was that on the way back from a show, I'm guessing, or?
I'll talk about that later, but I mean, Mike sort of took me under his wing from the amateur ranks, and obviously I knew a lot of fellas from my club turned professional. Iron Fist, Clive Myers, Lee Bronson, Bully Boy, John Hall, the Borg twins, you know, the list is endless. But when I got to the pro game, sort of Mike took me under his wing, and and then that was in 77, and ended up dying in my car on the 4 years later in 81. Wow. You know, I knew he wasn't well because he phoned me and asked me if I would take him to Folkestone, which wasn't like Mike. I mean, I don't know. Mike Marino was a god in this business, you know, and he should travel everywhere on his own. And I could see he wasn't well. And he was actually due to be on with Big Jim Harris, who became Kamala, you know, in the WWE.
Right. Yeah.
WWE. And I said to Mike, look, you know, you can't go. And the long and short of it is, they took him to a hospital. I picked him up on the way back. He had a fit in the car and he died in my arms on the side of the motorway.
Wow. What a story. What a story. Apologies for the dogs. You can probably hear them. They do like to make cameo appearances every so often. Little yappy things.
Just actually lost 2 bulldogs in the space of 5 weeks.
Yeah.
Which broke my heart. But we've got a puppy now. So she's sort of lightening up the house a bit.
Oh, fantastic.
Reno was God in this business, and
Yeah.
you know, it was such a shock. It came out later that he had leukemia, but he was only 58, Mike. You know, so full of life, and he was such a great character. And I know it's an old cliche, and I know I'm biased, but they don't make them like Mike anymore. You know, that's the old school.
We will take a deep dive into them early days, the late 70s, the 80s, and all the way through. But do you still keep in touch with the sport nowadays? Do you still pop and see shows? Do you go to conventions? Do you watch the sport on TV? What's your involvement with wrestling nowadays?
Yeah, I don't really have any. I do keep in touch, obviously, with some of my old ring mates, Lee Bronson. Our phone, you know, we've been friends for years, so we speak, you know, regular. Stevie Gray also, we speak regularly. You know, I still keep in touch with Johnny Kidd, James Mason. James told you that we have a meet-up. You know, we arrange a dinner at Victoria every now and again, and we have a meet-up with all the lads. As far as going to wrestling shows, funny enough, I was asked to one tonight at Howsham. Steve Barker is running the show there.
Right.
Obviously, I can't go because I'm doing this, but Steve came to see me lunchtime, and we spent a couple of hours talking about the old days. And yeah, so I don't go really to see wrestling these days. And I was very surprised that AEW, I understand, have sold 88,000 tickets for Wembley. So.
Phenomenal, yeah, and I'll be going to that show. And like I say, I went to Wembley when the WWF were in town 31 years ago, SummerSlam '92. So I know it's a different Wembley nowadays, but it should bring back some memories of when I was there as a 16-year-old for SummerSlam '92. And like I say, the WWF was a world away from what you used to back in the 70s and the 80s. But so I mean. I want to talk to you a bit about your last match then, Mal. And it was only 6 years ago, I understand, in 2017, when Chikara was over on these shores. And it was a King of Trios match, sort of 6-man tag. You were teaming with Danny Boy Collins and James Mason. Couldn't really have wished for two better friends, two better partners to have had your last match with.
That wasn't my last match. My last match on with James Mason at Gravesend, but the match you're talking about, yeah, they had to persuade me a little bit to do it because,
really,
yeah, because you know, I'm old school, and you know, this new, it's a different ball game to me anyway. But anyway, they persuaded me to do it, and it was a great day out, and I thoroughly enjoyed it, and it was great to be with James and Danny, and I think there's photographs. We're laughing our heads off and laughing and joking, and we just had a great time. James is a great professional, and Danny as well, you know. And yeah, it was just a great day. Stevie Gray came with us, and just for a day out, and it was a great time. But when I first came into business, every day was like that to me. You know, I was with those big stars every day, and I was very, very lucky. You know, I was very, very lucky. I had some great teachers, and you know, I don't know if people are still around to sort of. It's a different style now, John. As anyway, it's a different style. They're doing a different ball game and more acrobatic, shall I say?
Yeah. Like I say, I've had Johnny Kidd and James Mason and various others on the show, and I mean, we kind of spoke about how the traditional British style seems to be back in vogue again, to be honest with you, and there's more people around the world that are kind of finding out about world of sport, watching the old British action, and kind of picking up more traditional styles. So I think it comes in waves. I think it's having a bit of a resurgence, so that there's a bit more variety on shows. But yeah,
with William Regal, when he went to States, he always emulated the old world of sport days and always kept it right, which was great, you know. And Dave Taylor as well, and Dave Finlay, obviously, who went there, and they always kept it right. Because don't forget, in the old days before WWF evolved, they used to watch all our tapes from here. you know, Pete Roberts and Terry Rudge and everybody. That's how they first started out. It was by watching our tapes and that, you know, I mean, they still had their own sort of regional shows, but Vince McMahon, that's how they started. And whenever we meet any American wrestlers, when I used to go to shows, they always treat you with the greatest respect, which is all we ask for. That's all we ask for, and they're fantastic. They treat you, you know, like you are someone, like they are. You know, they treat you with great respect, which is great.
Yeah. Do you miss getting into the ring and
Yeah,
doing what you did best for 40 years? Do you miss the action and the atmosphere, the crowd, and the smell of the deep heat and all the grappling?
yeah. What I miss as well is the camaraderie in the dressing
Yeah.
room. I mean, I did say to Johnny Kidd once, because he said if he's going to write a book, he's going to put this quote in it. I did say that wrestling got in the way sometimes because we were having such a great time talking to everybody in the dressing room and doing what we do. And that wrestling actually got in the way sometimes. I had to put my boots on because I had them big high boots that took me half an hour.
Oh, brilliant. Take us back to when you were younger then, Mal, and what was going on in your life when you were a teenager? Were you academic? Were you sporty? What sort of a kid were you growing up?
Well, I was quite a good footballer, and you know, I played for the county and stuff. And I went to Crystal Palace for a trial. This is how the wrestling job started. I went to Crystal Palace for a trial, and they said, you're good enough, but you're not big enough. You're not, you know, because I was always very like slim lad. So I bought some weights and started weight training. And my parents were great wrestling fans. They used to go to Fairfield Halls in Croydon, which was a big venue for wrestling, and the Albert Hall. And I just went and I saw these people, and I thought to myself, God Almighty, that's fantastic. And in those days, the Albert Hall would be sold out. Croydon would be sold, and it was, you know, and it was just a fantastic spectacle. And I thought to myself, maybe this is for me. So that's when I was sort of 14, 15. So I joined an amateur wrestling club, which was totally different to the pro game, but that's the real stuff. And I was there for 4 years, and great 4 years, best 4 years of my life, because it taught me respect. It taught me never to take anybody at face value. And in those days, it was very difficult to get in the wrestling business. You know, no disrespect to what's happening now,
Yeah.
but in those days, it was like having a trial for Manchester United. You know, it was difficult to get in. And them having known you've done a bit of amateur was a great benefactor in that. So, and I respect anybody that has done anything. So
Yeah.
I got
And
to know,
go on, please carry on.
I got to know people like Lee Bronson and, you know, Clive Myers, and therefore they sort of got me into the Dale Martins gym for a trial, as it were. And I was there for 6 months before I even got a wrestling job. And going through hell, they put me on with people like Pete Robert. I mean, this is proper. This is not show wrestling. This is proper wrestling.
Yeah.
And Pete Roberts, who'd just come back from Japan, a fellow called Lenny Hurst, Dave Bond. These were all consummate professionals, but great amateurs as well. And that was my, you know, first taste of getting roughed up, as it were. But that's what you did in those days. You had to, you know, last that course before you could get into the business. And, you know, lucky enough I did, and I was at the right place at the right time, and they liked me, and that was it. So, but it was tough. It was tough to get in the business.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, you mentioned your training as an amateur gave you a bit of an advantage when you kind of went into the pro game, and obviously you had the fundamentals down, and you lasted the course as well. And I've listened to many top pros from that sort of era said that, you know, it was a rough, tough sport, a rough, tough business. But if you could, you know, get through it, then, you know, you were respected by your peers and generally did very well. And you mentioned Dale Martin's obviously part of joint promotion, and you were straight in with Dale Martin and joint promotion show from the off, really, weren't you, Mel?
Yeah. Well, I was at the sort of right place at the right time. I mean, you know, I think Mick liked me as well, McManus, who was the matchmaker at those times, and I was lucky. You know, I was on TV after a few weeks, and then lucky enough to be given the belt. You know, like a year later or so. So I have no disillusions that I was some fantastic being that had to do with this. I was in the right place at the right time, and I was respectful. And you get on if you're like that. You know, if you go start sort of thinking know everything. But these fellas could have ripped me head off. You know, they're tough fellas. You know, and people like Peter Zakash and Zolly Boschick. You know, Peter Zakash wrestled for Hungary Olympic Games. You know, these fellas were the real deal. So I can remember. It wasn't in my time, but just before my time. If you was a lightweight, you couldn't get changed in the heavyweights dressing room. That's what it was like.
Interesting, very interesting. I haven't heard that before. That's really, really interesting. And you mentioned about the Royal Albert Hall and various venues selling out to packed crowds in that era where wrestling was just, it was so popular in the 70s and the 80s. But I mean, you made several appearances at the Royal Albert Hall, didn't you? And even very early on in your career that you were performing at the Royal Albert Hall. That must have been a bit of a thrill for you, but maybe slightly daunting at the same time.
Yeah, it was and I can remember the first time I was there, I've mentioned Lee Bronson. His dad was a wrestler called Norman the Butcher. And Norman would always be there in a suit and tie, dressed up, and he'd walk you into the ring. And this particular night, in those days, it used to go in complete darkness, and a spotlight would just come onto the steps where you're walking up from the level. And when you're walking out in front of 5,000 people. When I was doing that, when I was like 18, on with Mick McManus, top of the bill, and it's it's a bit surreal, really, at the time. But when you get in the ring, you just treat it as another match. But and in those days, of course, people could smoke, so you couldn't really see. It was like a fog with the. You couldn't really see because there was so much smoke and light. But fantastic experience. Just fantastic.
One night that really kind of stands out when I was doing my research, and in the Royal Albert Hall once again, November the 23rd, 1978, and I think you wrestled 2 matches on that show, and it was quite common for the wrestlers, for the talent to wrestle multiple matches on a show, but I think you wrestled Mark Rollerball Rocco earlier on in the evening, and then later on you was involved in a 6-man, and you were tagging with Big Daddy, Johnny Sheslav against Bruiser Muir, Mark Rocco again, and Sid Cooper. Do you remember that outing? Because you probably would have been in the business maybe a year at the Royal Albert Hall, wrestling Rollerball Rocco, 2 matches in one night. Does that stand out to you? That sounds like a pretty special evening.
Let me just tell you something, Jonas. We were talking. This is what a privileged life I've had. We were talking the other day, and Steve Gray said to me, "Do you remember that night we were at Croydon, me, you, and Big Daddy against Haystacks, Rocco, and Rocky Moran, and we walked instead of coming out at the side of the hall, we walked from the back of the hall, which was a long walk to the ring, with a spotlight on us, and it took us 10 minutes to get in the ring." He said to me, "Do you remember?" And I said, "No, I don't." But that's not because I've got Alzheimer's. That's because I had such a great time that even that didn't stand out in my memory as being a fantastic night, because I had so many fantastic nights.
Absolutely. Please carry on.
That's how great it was in those days. People say to me, "Oh, do you remember that?" And I mean, I do remember certain things, but it was just one day after the other was just like Disneyland.
Yeah.
People ask me where I lived. I say I lived in Disneyland for 50 years. Now I live just outside it.
Let me ask you, who gave you, or when did you first get the nickname Superstar Sanders, Superstar Mel Sanders? Who gave you that?
I think it was Max Crabtree when they gave me the belt. He gave me that. Max was he was a great promoter, and he was you know, he had a great vision, Max Crabtree, you know, and I liked him a lot. We got on well. A lot of people didn't get on with him, but I got on with him well. And I went to see him. Me and Steve went to see him when you know, the game was all finished. We went up to his farm, and he actually got quite tearful when we left, because I don't think he used to see many of the boys, you know. But at one time, Max Crabtree was the person that you wanted to work for, and he was the main man, you know. But I think it was, gave me that name. I think it was Max Crabtree.
And you mentioned it just a minute ago, Mal, and it's the European Middleweight Championship. And I think when people associate you with any championship, I think that one sticks out, the European Middleweight. And I think you won it a couple of times, didn't you? Back in, I think, 79, then again in about 86. But thinking back to that bout in particular, that championship, what did it mean to you to be a champion of that prestigious title?
It was fantastic being so young. And at the time, Brian Maxine was the British middleweight champion. So we used to do G's and, you know, and rematches everywhere. And Brian Maxine was a fantastic villain in this business. Not so great, and didn't get over so great as a Blue Eye, but he was a fantastic villain and took fantastic bumps. And he used to do a thing where he grabbed the microphone at the end of the match and would scream and shout at everybody and drive them bananas. Fantastic. I understand now that he's not in great health. He's got a touch of dementia, but in those days he was a big star. And now these are the people you got to thank, because without people like that, you are nobody. You do it on your own, you know. So. And there was just fantastic people around that taught me, and, you know, I was very lucky, very lucky.
Absolutely. And one individual I want to talk about in particular, and that's we mentioned him earlier, Mark Rollerball Rocco. And I think you had the privilege of wrestling Mark a few times at the Royal Albert Hall, at Wembley Arena, and various places around the UK. I think he'll go down as a bit of a pioneer of the business for the style that he introduced and made famous all over the world. And I think he probably started maybe 7 or 8 years ahead of you, Mal. But what are your memories of working Mark Rollerball Rocco back in the 70s and the 80s?
It was a tough night if you was on with Rocco. You knew you were going to get kicked. You knew you were going to get punched. You knew there could be a bit of blood knocking about. But I loved him as a man. He was fabulous company. He had a fabulous personality. You knew that when you were with him anywhere, it was just going to be a laugh from start to finish. In the ring, he was years ahead of his time. And I used to love. I'd have worked with him every night. A lot of people didn't like working with him. A lot of people would say, oh, he's a bit stiff, and, you know, this, that, and the other, and he's kicked me. And there's actually a story, and this is the truth, I haven't got to lie. There's actually a story that somebody actually retired from the business because they were on Morocco. And
wow.
Because that's the way it was going. But that's the way it was with Mark. You know, he gave it, and you know, if you gave it back to him, then he had to take it. That was good. But that's what annoys me when people say to me, oh, well, you know, it's a lot of acting, and it's a lot of this and a lot of that. I've had 22 stitches in my face and probably as many in my body. So, you know, if that's acting, then something's gone wrong somewhere on the line.
Far from it. Absolutely, yeah.
If you got kicked by Rocco, you knew you got kicked by Rocco. And there was a few fellas in the business that were a bit, you know, like that. But that's the way it was. If they were like that to you, then, you know, you had to give it back, or you had to stand and take it. And, you know.
Well, this is it. And people like Rollerball Rocco and various others from your generation, that they took the sport very seriously, and they didn't want people in the audience or at home to think, oh, you know, he's just play fighting, or that didn't really hurt. If you lay it in, it's going to look like it's really going to hurt. So they believed in realism, didn't they?
Of course. And I always used to say to people, you know, I used to lift the ropes up and say, well, come in and have a go. And they'd say, oh, no, you know, you might hurt me. Well, that's the chance you know, I mean, it's, you know, since WWE came out as it being entertainment, yeah, I mean, it is entertainment, but it's still not easy. You know, I was wrestling then 6 nights a week, every month, every year, for years and years. You know, we got Sundays off, maybe even in the summer. Sometimes you didn't get a Sunday off. You know, because you get your date sheet a month before, so you knew where you were and if you were up north or if you were down south or wherever. And if you got a night off, I would arrange to go out with friends. But then 2 days before, someone would be injured, so you'd have to work. So I never got a day off for years, but I wouldn't change it. It was absolutely fantastic.
You mentioned about the date sheet and about the schedule there, and I'm guessing that it was a full-time living for you back in the day, Mal.
Oh no, I was working as well.
You was working as well.
I used to work for the GLC in London for the architects department. I used to be in charge of getting all the materials for the education premises like schools, nurseries, colleges. But I had my brother-in-law was my ultimate governor. So if I had to shoot off early, he used to let me do that. And I wouldn't have been able to, there would have been no superstar Mal Sanders if it hadn't have been for Bill Burden. And I tell him that every time I see him, because those days when we went to Yarmouth and Weymouth, we used to leave at 12 o'clock because there was not motorways like that. No M25 in the late 70s. So we had to leave the appropriate time. So we had to meet at Brixton and we would leave for those shows in our own cars. We could leave in those days from the Midlands, Birmingham, Leicester at 4 o'clock. Now, you'd have to leave at 4 o'clock the previous day, probably.
You would, yeah.
So, yeah, probably a big thing, you know. I was on the road for 25, 30 years.
Yeah. Tell us a bit about your wrestling style now, because I know that we've described it as a traditional British style. And when you think of that, you think of the likes of Johnny Saint and maybe Johnny Kidd and various others that were very, very smooth and technical in the ring. Yourself, I mean, I've seen a number of your matches in preparation for this, a whole ton of matches actually, Mal. And you struck me as being quite a fast-paced wrestler. There was a lot of pace. There was a lot of, speed in your game, as well as the technical side as well. And that couldn't be said for all of the stars back then. But yeah, you certainly had the pace around the ring, as well as the technical chops as well.
I was younger then. Let me just clear something up before we carry on. Johnny Kidd's name, Mr. Smooth, was given to him by me.
Okay.
I could pull a tablecloth out of his pocket and put it on the table, and the knives and forks and a candelabra would already be on there alight. That's getting back to the wrestling. Yeah, well, in those days, when you're young, I've always been quite athletic. So, and I was on with people, Stevie Gray, they were all fast movers. Rocco was a fantastic mover. Yeah, as you get older, what I did when I'd been in the game 10, 15 years, I decided that it was more fun to be a villain. So I sort of changed my, what can I say, not persona, but my image, I suppose. I sort of started to lean a little bit. A fantastic person who used to do that was Terry Rudge. Have you heard of Terry Rudge, John?
Absolutely.
Terry Rudge could, start off wrestling, and he'd just lean on people, but the crowd would be going bananas. We just had, I would never be in his class, but, and then they took me as a villain. So I enhanced that. I like that because it's all right being a goody, but, it was more fun for me being a villain.
You do hear that an awful lot, you really do. But I mean, my very next subject was going to be about how popular you were with the fans, especially in them early days. I think a lot of the matches I saw of yours was probably from the early 80s. I think, I can't remember the name of the guy now, but John English maybe. But the crowd were just so raucous for you, especially as the Blue Eye.
But I mean, yeah, they were fantastic. It was a different sort of crowd then.
Yeah,
I mean, I was speaking to Steve Barker today, and it's a different sort of crowd. People would go in bow ties in those days to the Albert Hall, and in suits, you know, with ties and stuff on, you know. That's the sort of people that went. It's more family orientated now. The shows are more sort of family orientated. But yeah, and then they did give me a fan club, and we had a couple of 100 people in it. And the lady used to run it from Cheltenham, and yeah, just, you know, it was good. That they all had fans, you know. It was a good time. It was a great time to be in the business then. You know, they called it the golden era. It probably was in those days, because I was just saying today as well to him, you know, we used to get trips abroad. I'd be in Africa, and I'd be to Dubai, and I'd be to Iceland, and I'd be to Spain. And I don't know if that still happens, does it? Do they still get?
They do indeed. A lot of the UK talent get booked all over Europe and further afield. Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of people still look at UK wrestling, British wrestling, and British wrestlers as, you know, the cream of the crop. And yeah, we're still wanted internationally as well.
Yeah, there's been some great guys here still. You know, I mean, I'm not in touch really with it now, John. To be honest, you know, it's sort of I mean, I know I only finished 6 years ago, but I don't know. I know like people like Jodie Flesh and Johnny Storm, you know, but the new people, you know, I've really no contact with. But I did say to Steve, next time he has a show at Howsham or near here, I'll go. And if James Mason runs a show, he runs a show sometimes in Eastbourne here at the Hippodrome. So I will go along, but not that I know anybody. But I think Bamber was there last time. He was the only one I knew, Lee Bamber. Yeah, it's just good to watch it, and you know, good to be around the boys. But it's not the same. But then I'm biased, aren't I? You know. So.
Well, this is it, because you grew up in what many would say is probably, you know, the very best period that British wrestling has ever seen. And of course, we've had some peaks. And I know that, dare I say it, BritWres was very popular in the mid 2010s and caught the attention of, you know, the American promotions. But when you're talking the golden era, yeah, everybody knows about the 1970s, the 1980s of British wrestling, and that's the era that really sticks out as being the best for British wrestling for sure.
Well, I hope so, but you know, I don't want to disappoint anybody now. I mean, there's some great athletes that are around, you know, and I respect that, but because it was on television, because it had a prime spot. I don't know if you know. I'll just tell you this little fact that actually one year when it was always on Cup Final day. And when Mick McManus fought Jackie Pallo, I can't remember, but it was probably late 60s, they had more viewers than the actual cup final. That's how popular it was in those days. So
incredible.
That just...